Rice billbug is going to end up being the #1 insect pest we're going to deal with in row rice. You know, they'll get an inch, inch and a quarter long. It's a big weevil. It'll be extremely obvious when you see them, fairly slow moving. What you see in the literature is basically in all the production guides, they call it rice levee billbug because we're used to seeing it on levees in a flooded field. And that's basically all it says. You know, there's no real information there. There's no information on really scouting for it, control options, that sort of thing. And it's because it's generally never been a major pest. You know, it's been regulated to levees. Well, now that we've removed the levees out of it and gone to this furrow system on a fairly large percentage of our acres now in Arkansas, we basically have turned that whole top end of the field into a quote unquote levee. You know, it stays moist, but it's not wet, it's not flooded. And that's where those billbugs like to be. And what we've seen is the longer we've, had row rice in a given area or a given field, the higher those populations get. This turn row that's over here beside us, it used to be a whole lot of Bermuda on that turn row, and it's still a fair amount. And then there's this thin tree line here, and we basically threw all kinds of traps out there trying to figure out if there's a way to monitor these things moving into the field. Well, with all the trapping data that we've got there, we found out you can't really scout based on the traps. But what you can do is kind of monitor that population moving into the field. And at least for this area of the state, the bottom half of northeast Arkansas into northeast Arkansas, it seems like between the last week of May, first couple weeks of June is where we see a major migration move into fields. Now that also generally lines up with rice being at 2 or 3 tillers if we're planted in a normal time frame. But what seems to happen, these grassier turn rows, particularly with Bermuda, that Bermuda makes a great host between early spring when they start coming out of overwintering before that rice gets big enough for them to feed on. They also tend to overwinter both in the field and along the edges of fields. A lot of times what you'll see when that rice starts drying down, you can go look up under your poly pipe and you'll see thousands of billbugs under there. And what that is them migrating out of the field trying to find an overwintering spot. Okay, so we mentioned some of that early season damage. And I know this rice is heading right now, but you can still see quite a bit of this damage out here and in front of me. And this is kind of what we see with billbugs. You'll see scattered damage all throughout a field, but you tend to see these kind of hot spots out there. And we've had folks kind of confuse it with sheath blight, those sort of things. The two things we get a lot of questions on, we'll show some blank heads here in a minute, is how do I know for sure it's billbug damage? And you see all these burnout leaves down here, down in this canopy. And if you reach down there and you start pulling those tillers that have those kind of those leaves that are brown colored on there that you can tell are dead, you start pulling those and they break off at the soil profile. And what you'll see is you can kind of see a little bit of a root left on here, but generally they're chewed off. And you can keep pulling them, and if they break off at the soil profile that easy, it's all going to be billbug injury. And so like on this plant here, we see this chewing that occurred down here at the bottom, but you see how easy this plant's breaking right here. And if we start peeling it apart, you can see all this chewing that's occurred down in here. And that's where that larvae, generally that larvae stays below this first joint right here. They stay between the soil profile and that first joint. They'll feed up and down it. They'll get a little size to themselves and they'll bore out of the side of it. And you can see where that larvae's hollowed out that whole stem right there, fed up and down it. You can see some frass inside of it, those sort of things. And so this tiller's gonna die. And this is what we were talking about earlier about that early season feeding being a better indicator of yield loss. These tillers are never going to make a head. They're going to die before this crop ever starts heading. And you can see in this area right here, there's a ton of blank tillers. If we just start pulling, it takes nothing to find 10, 12, 15 of these dead tillers laying in here. And it's all from billbugs. And so, what we've seen is it's fairly common. It's fairly common to see somewhere around 10% injury or so in almost every row rice field. With that being said, if we compare those seed treatment packages we mentioned earlier, adding that diamide seed treatment to it, it does not make it bulletproof. They still have to feed on it to die. What we generally see is about a 60 to 70% reduction, 50 to 60% reduction anyways, in overall damage than what we do where we're using just a standard neonic package. So, you know, we were talking about some of that early season damage and counting those tillers and looking at how much damage we have out there, that sort of thing. And these are just a couple random plants we pulled out here. And if we look, you know, we got a total of 6 tillers on this plant. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, then 5 and 6. So if you notice these tillers over here on the right hand side, how green they are, but these two on the left, see how brown they are. If we pull them, they break off at the base. We can see that feeding again. And so if you figure on we got 6 tillers out, you know, total on this plant, 2 of them damaged, you know, that's 33% damage right there. We have another one up here that has considerably more damage in it. So we got another plant here, you know, it's got quite a few more tillers on it, but if we look, even without counting, about 50% of them just pulls off at the base, right? And there's a ton of damage right here on this. You can see a few of them have blank heads up here at the top. One thing you can do if you start pulling these plants and you want to look for larvae is you can start busting open the root crown here. And we didn't have to dig far for this. You can see that kind of cream colored larvae there. He's sort of trying to hide on us a little bit with that bright red head. So that's a larval stage of a billbug. And you know, I got to be honest with you, if you're finding some, there's probably a lot more out there you're not finding. They don't seem to be the easiest thing to find. We'll pull all the plants up in 5 row feet, and our untreateds may be running 50 to 60% dead tillers out there, but we may only find 1 or 2 larvae in that 5 row feet. So they're kind of difficult to find, especially once they move into the root zone. But you can see that one there. That larvae is probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the way grown. A lot of times they'll be, if you bust that root crown open further, a lot of times they'll be right in there. One thing you see with those larvae is a lot of times they feed right at the base of a tiller and prune those roots off. So you can still see a few roots attached to this plant, but you see how it's pruned off. They've pretty well eaten all the roots off of that. You know, that's what causes some of the blank tillers. That's also what causes a lot of blank heads. And that's one reason we see some of these like partially blank heads in some cases. You know, where like half the head will be blanked out sort of thing. It's still billbug damage, but odds are they started feeding on that tiller as it was about to produce that head and kind of killed it off at the tail end there. So like I said, you know, that migration into the field, it's about a 3-week period. And so that damage is kind of staged out over a 3 to 4 week period there as well. It doesn't all just occur at once sort of thing. It's kind of, and that's why we see all these different kind of manifestations of that damage, whether it's totally blank heads, these half blank heads, or a lot of these tillers that die off early in the year. So one last thing I want to mention on these blank heads, you know, we also deal with a borer complex, a stem borer complex in Arkansas and rice, and it's not as bad as like states like Louisiana, Texas. You know, they deal with some pretty severe stem borer. We don't deal with a lot of it here, but we see it every year. And we'll get questions on whether or not this is billbug injury or if this is stem borer injury. And the one easy thing you can do is go pull that head. And, you know, for a billbug, like I mentioned, you know, several times at this point, if you pull those heads on those billbugs, if it's blank, a lot of times there's 2 things you see. That whole stem is going to be tan colored, whereas like stem borer in a lot of cases is a bright white head with the stem usually generally still green. The other thing with billbug, if it breaks off at the soil, that's billbug. If it kind of slips out of the joint, like if I pulled this head and it slipped out somewhere right in here, that's going to be stem borer. So if it breaks off at the soil, 99% of the time it's going to be billbug. You can see this plant over here that has these really healthy roots on it. You know, it's a pretty well intact root system. Whereas you can see these 3 tillers here that have been fed on by billbugs. We essentially have no roots, very few roots, essentially none. And then this plant, this is one of them that'll end up making a blank head at the end of the season. You know, it's got quite a bit of feeding on it, you know, especially if you compare it to this one. But it's not totally dead. And so that's generally where those blank heads come from. Some of this feeding here where they're pruning on those roots really good, but they haven't quite eat it down like this. This is that damage that we see around green ring and a 1/2 inch, that general time frame where those tillers will just outright die and never try to produce a head. So we were talking about blank heads with bill bugs and how to determine whether or not it's bill bug or stem borer. And we were pulling all those blank heads and we saw that they were chewed off at the soil surface, breaking off at the soil surface, missing roots. Actually, down here at the bottom end of this field, there's a little bit of stem borer. And if we look at those tillers, you see all the roots attached to it and stuff, right? We don't have that bill bug, that root feeding going on, but we're seeing those blank heads. And as we were mentioning earlier, like if we pull on these blank heads and it's stem borer, you see how it slides out of the joint there. It doesn't necessarily break off at the soil. And in a lot of cases, we can take those and start splitting them. I have no idea if larvae are gonna be in here. There's one right there. You can see all these stem borer larvae in here. We got a couple on my fingers, several up and down this stalk over here. And so it's easy to tell the difference between them. Bill bug breaks off at the soil line. It won't have any roots to it, whereas these stem borers, it'll kind of slide out of the sheath pretty easily, and if you start peeling it apart, a lot of times you can find larvae inside of it. Generally right now, what we've seen is our best option is adding a diamide seed treatment to our seed. And you know, it sounds really repetitive what we talk about with rice water weevils, but it is true here. You know, that's the first thing we saw in this field. We planted a study with a bunch of different seed treatments, had some foliars in there. This was all back in 2018. The rice billbug's always been known for blank heads, these white heads that you see at the end of the season when that rice starts heading. As we come out here and rated all these plots, and you see no difference, like between our untreated where we never sprayed versus what ended up being our best treatment in there, we saw no difference in blank heads. And to this day, we still don't see a reduction there from really any of our treatments that we've been testing. But then we put a combine in it and we start seeing these 20, 30 bushel increases where we had these diamides. And really it seems like the sweet spot to try to figure out how much yield loss potential is gonna happen is around green ring to half-inch joint movement, somewhere in there. At that point, you'll start seeing a lot of dead tillers, and it seems like those dead tillers at that point in time of the year tell more of the story of how much damage we have as compared to blank heads at the end of the season. You know, you take a lot of like our caterpillar pest, right? And it's the larval stage doing the damage. Stink bugs, you know, like both the nymphs and adults can do the damage. What we see with bill bugs is similar to that. You know, rice water weevil and flooded rice, the adults do some leaf scarring, but it really is kind of meaningless. Then the larvae go and prune roots. We see something kind of similar here, except for the adults can cause quite a bit of damage. It seems like those adults, they'll come into the field, they feed on a few tillers, they'll end up laying an egg in one of those tillers, then the larvae ends up feeding in 1 to 2 tillers before it moves down in the soil. And when it moves down to the soil, it starts pruning roots down there, and it almost seems like it prunes roots directly related to a tiller, not like a generalist root feeder like what we see with rice water weevil. And that's what's causing those blank heads during the season. So we got to deal with both stages of that pest. With those diamides, there is mortality there. They don't like feeding on it. They end up dying, you know, 3 to 4 days after feeding. Whereas like our standard Nick packages that we use on a bulk of our rice in the state, it really doesn't deter them at all. Part of that could be that, you know, we only get 28, maybe 35 days of residual out of those Nicks, and it could be that they're just sort of playing out before those bill bugs really move into the field. And you know, that's one thing that we noticed is they're not like, say, a rice stink bug or a moth that's gonna pick up and they can move a couple miles over some days if they need to find the right host. You don't see that with rice billbug. I don't want to call them lazy, but they're not good flyers. So generally, I think that's why we see a lot of pressure around tree lines. They'll crawl up the side of them trees, they'll pitch off of it and kind of glide out into the field. You see the same thing late in the year. You know, we mentioned them getting up under polypipe, but it's not uncommon for us to get a lot of phone calls when that rice starts to dry down. Guys are out there checking for rice stink bug using a sweep net, and they'll start catching them in their sweep net. Well, it's the same concept. They're crawling up to the top of that plant. They're not feeding on it. They're just trying to get up high so they can pitch out of the field and go find an overwintering spot. The other interesting thing we found, you know, generally with a lot of our insect pests or insects in general, you know, they overwinter in one life stage, whether that be a larvae or a pupae or as an adult. It's generally one life stage. What we found with rice billbugs, and this is actually the first place we noticed that, is that they're multivoltine. In other words, they can overwinter as any life stage. You know, a bulk of them we found are pupae or adults, but we also found a lot of larvae, and those larvae don't seem to die over the winter. They seem to just hang out and almost be in a diapause stage themselves, and then as things start greening up in the spring, you know, we see that damage start occur there. They'll get back active. And that may be why seed treatments have seemed to perform very well there. We haven't really laid or figured out a ratio there of what percent's overwinter in the field versus what's out of the field. And so it could be that a large number of them are just overwintering there in the field, and that may be why we see better control with those seed treatments versus a foliar. You know, I do think rotating is an important thing, you know, to help actually this field. So I think it went 6 years in a row being row rice, rotated to soybeans, trying to clean up some of the volunteer rice, weedy rice, grass, those kind of issues. And then we went back into row rice the following year. Well, we put plots up here that first year out of beans, and you know, our pressure was pretty low. But here we are, we're 2 years continuous row rice at this point. Now, I gotta be honest with you, this is some of the most severe pressure I've seen up here in the 7 or 8 years that we've had plots established up here. We've also seen it if you rotate just across turn rows, they do have the ability to migrate from this field across the turn row to the other. So it almost seems like from a rotational standpoint, if you're gonna rotate, you almost need to have big blocks of row rice and then rotate that into big blocks of soybeans and have a pretty good distance in between them. But I don't know that that would always work. You know, I think it was 18 or 19, right outside of McGee, just northeast of McGee. We looked at a field that had been 10 years continuous soybeans. First year they put it in row rice, it was some pretty severe damage across the top of the field. So while I called them lazy flyers and they're kind of, you know, they're not extremely mobile, they'll go where they need to go to find a host.